thousands protested outside the Knesset in Jerusalem ahead of the swearing-in of Benjamin Netanyahu's hardline government. Police estimated that there were around 3,000 demonstrators present, including lawmakers from the incoming opposition, organizers of the anti-Netanyahu protest from his previous term, as well as many rights groups and liberal organizations, including the Reform Jewish movement. The demonstrators called out chants against racism and corruption and promised to, quote, banish the darkness of this new government, while waving Israeli as well as pride flags. The protests come on the backs of the recent outpouring of condemnation over demands by the Religious Zionism Party, a coalition partner, to allow businesses to refuse service to certain customers on the basis of their religious beliefs. The potential law has been blasted by many as being discriminatory. And joining me now live from Miami is Alan Dershowitz, Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School. Thank you very much for coming on the show this evening.
Well, thank you. First of all, mazel tov to Bibi Netanyahu, who has been my friend for 50 years, though I disagree with him on a great many issues. And I hope he will be able to move the government more to the center. But he has been a great and strong leader of Israel, longest-serving prime minister. And I wish him well on his three efforts, particularly 1 and 3, stopping Iran and making peace with other countries in the area.
I want to start by discussing the discrimination law. While members of the new government have been relatively open about who would be targets, so to speak, the law is actually pretty ambiguous. So my question is this law fundamentally discriminatory?
It's exactly the same as the American law is going to be. The Supreme Court of the United States has a case before it right now on which the issue is whether or not bakers or people who are printers can refuse to deal with people who are gay based on their religious beliefs. Actually, the Israeli law is considerably better than the American law because it requires that there be equivalent services available at a reasonable price. I don't like the law. It's no good, but it would turn Israel into something like what the United States will be. In fact, I just came back from 5 weeks in Israel, and the main bottom line is that Israel and the United States are very similar. They're mirror images of each other. Deeply divided countries. In the United States, it's the hard left that's trying to destroy the Supreme Court, trying to destroy free speech, trying to destroy equality. And in Israel, it's the hard right. In both countries, the pendulum swings widely. I remember once having a dinner with Bill Clinton in which he said, my only complaint about Israel is that it's a democracy, damn it. And that means the voters decide who to put in office. I wouldn't have voted for Ben Gvir, but a lot of Israelis, including kibbutzniks and Arabs, voted for him. It's a democracy. And when you have a democracy, nobody is going to be completely satisfied with the result. It's a process. And I have great confidence in Bibi Netanyahu in being able to move his government toward the center. He's been a center-right person since I've known him, and I think he will continue to try to move the government toward the center.
And speaking of dissatisfaction, another proposed law here causing major uproar is something known as the override clause, that a simple majority in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, could override a Supreme Court ruling. Would this essentially weaken the court system here? And then what happens to Israel's checks and balances system?
Well, it would weaken it greatly. And I spent a lot of my time with Benjamin Netanyahu on my recent trip trying to argue for a compromise. That is a compromise that would not give Knesset the power to override basic Supreme Court decisions about equality, human rights, and dignity, while perhaps giving them the right to override decisions that are particularly political or economic, for example, like the legality of the gas deal with Lebanon. And I think to get an override of anything fundamental, you should need a supermajority, which would make it multi-partisan rather than simply partisan. I think this is a work in progress. I think Netanyahu and I disagree about this, but it will not turn Israel into a dictatorship. It will eliminate and reduce checks and balances in the power of the Supreme Court and make it much more difficult for people like me to defend Israel in courts like the International Criminal Court on issues like complementarity. But again, it's very much a matter of degree. People should not overstate what's going on in Israel. They shouldn't be using terms like apartheid or tyranny. It's a democracy in transition. It's moving to the right. That's the nature of democracy.
And speaking of someone that you mentioned that you wouldn't personally have voted for, Itamar Ben Gvir from the Jewish Power Party. Regarding Israel's security, there's now laws giving immunity to soldiers and police for crimes committed against Palestinians, as well as making changes to open fire rules that are now being pushed by the Israeli government, in particular Itamar Ben Gvir. What do you make of such laws that will be coming into play?
Well, I don't think there will be. I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu will allow different rules of engagement depending on whether a person who's throwing rocks is an Arab or a Jew. That would violate international laws and would open up Israel to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So I hope that nobody would seriously consider laws which create different rules of engagement based on religion, race, or ethnicity. That would be absolutely wrong. And those of us who have fought for human rights and fought for Zionism in Israel will continue to fight against that. But I am fairly confident that that extreme rule itself will not be enacted by the Knesset.
And as you just mentioned, in the eyes of the international community, what can happen to Israel with all these potential incoming laws? How will it impact the Jewish state in the eyes of America, in the eyes of the world, and according to international law?
Well, remember that Israel is a pariah in the international community. The International Criminal Court hasn't been fair. The International Court of Justice, the General Assembly, the United Nations, nothing Israel does is ever acceptable. It's not what Israel does, it's what it is, the nation state of the Jewish people. But Israel should not make it easier for the double standard to be applied to it. And it should try as best as it can to apply what are the traditions of Judaism, the traditions of liberalism, the traditions of democracy. And again, this is a work in progress, and people shouldn't assume conclusions. I think Secretary Blinken was absolutely right when he said he's going to judge Israel not what white people say, but by what the actions of the government actually are. And I think the actions of the government should continue to be what they have been for many years, civil libertarian. Look, there's no country in the world faced with threats similar to those threats by Israel that has ever had a better record of civil rights, human dignity, application of the rule of law and concern for civilians. I hope that that tradition remains. But even if it doesn't, it will make Israel more like many other countries in the world that are not pariahs. Israel should not accept, nor should supporters of Israel ever accept a double standard to be applied to the nation state of the Jewish people.